Captain Marcus Thompson had always been the type of man who demanded respect through fear rather than earning it through leadership. At 32 years old, he stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl that seemed etched into his weathered face. His dark hair was always perfectly trimmed, according to military regulations, and his uniform was spotless, pressed to perfection. But beneath the polished exterior lay a man with serious anger management issues that the military had somehow overlooked during his rise through the ranks. The Riverside Military Base in Colorado was home to over 3,000 personnel, including support staff, trainers, and family members. It was a place where discipline and order were supposed to reign supreme, where every action was governed by strict codes of conduct and military law. The base had state-of-the-art facilities, including multiple gymnasiums, training grounds, administrative buildings, and residential quarters for both single soldiers and military families. Captain Thompson had been stationed at Riverside for 2 years, and in that time he had developed a reputation among the lower-ranking soldiers. They feared him, not because he was an exceptional leader or because he inspired them to be better soldiers, but because of his explosive temper and his tendency to abuse his authority. He would scream at privates for minor infractions, assign excessive punishments for small mistakes, and create an atmosphere of tension wherever he went. The other officers had noticed Thompson's behavior, but military culture often protected those in positions of power, especially when they maintained the appearance of discipline and order. His superiors saw results in his unit's performance during drills and exercises, not knowing that this performance came from fear rather than genuine respect or motivation. Thompson had learned to be careful around his equals and superiors, saving his worst behavior for those who couldn't fight back without risking their careers. Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old, a civilian fitness instructor who had been hired by the base to work with military personnel and their families. She had moved to Colorado 6 months earlier, taking the job because it offered good benefits and the opportunity to work with people who valued physical fitness. Sarah had always been passionate about helping others achieve their health goals, and she thought working on a military base would be the perfect environment for someone with her background. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Ohio where she had been active in sports throughout high school and college. She had studied exercise science and nutrition, earning her degree with honors before working at several civilian gyms and fitness centers. She was known for her positive attitude, her ability to motivate people, and her professional approach to fitness training. Her clients loved working with her because she made exercise fun while still pushing them to achieve their goals. When Sarah first arrived at Riverside, she was impressed by the facilities and the dedication of the military personnel she worked with. The base gym was equipped with the latest exercise equipment, spacious areas for group classes, and specialized training areas for different types of workouts. She quickly established herself as a valuable member of the fitness staff, developing popular classes and building relationships with both military personnel and their families. The base commander, Colonel James Harrison, was a 55-year-old career military officer who had served with distinction for over 30 years. He was known throughout the military for his fair leadership style, his commitment to maintaining high standards, and his zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. Colonel Harrison believed that the military's strength came not just from superior training and equipment, but from the character and integrity of its personnel. Colonel Harrison had noticed Captain Thompson during his time at Riverside, and while Thompson's unit performed well during evaluations, there had been subtle signs that all was not well. Several soldiers had requested transfers from Thompson's unit, though they had been reluctant to specify their reasons. There had been complaints about Thompson's leadership style, but nothing concrete enough to warrant formal disciplinary action. Military culture often protected officers from accusations that couldn't be proven, and Thompson was careful to avoid crossing obvious lines when he knew he was being watched. The colonel had also met Sarah Mitchell during his regular visits to the base facilities. He was impressed by her professionalism and the positive impact she was having on base morale. The fitness program had improved significantly since her arrival, with more personnel participating in regular exercise and fewer fitness-related disciplinary issues. Sarah had also developed programs for military families, helping to strengthen the sense of community on the base. On the morning of March 15th, the base was operating under its normal routine. Soldiers were attending training sessions, administrative staff were handling paperwork and logistics, and the various support services were functioning smoothly. The weather was crisp and clear, typical for Colorado in early spring, and there was a sense of energy and purpose throughout the base. Sarah arrived at the gym early that morning, as was her custom. She liked to prepare for her classes in advance, setting up equipment and reviewing her lesson plans. Her first class of the day was a mixed fitness session that included both military personnel and their family members. These classes had become very popular because Sarah had a gift for creating workouts that were challenging enough for trained soldiers while still being accessible to civilians who might not have the same level of fitness. Captain Thompson was not scheduled to attend Sarah's class that morning. He typically preferred to work out alone or with other officers, avoiding the group classes that he considered beneath his status. However, his regular workout partner had called in sick, and Thompson found himself with an hour to fill before his next meeting. He decided to check out the group fitness class, partly out of boredom and partly because he had heard other officers talking about the civilian instructor. When Thompson entered the gym, Sarah was in the middle of leading her class through a series of cardiovascular exercises. The class included about 20 people, ranging from enlisted soldiers to officers' wives to civilian support staff. The atmosphere was positive and energetic, with participants encouraging each other and following Sarah's clear, enthusiastic instructions. Thompson positioned himself at the back of the class, not bothering to introduce himself or ask permission to join. This was typical behavior for him. He expected others to accommodate his presence without question, regardless of the circumstances. Sarah noticed the new participant but continued with her class, assuming he would follow along with the established routine. The workout progressed through various stations, including strength training, cardio intervals, and flexibility exercises. Sarah moved throughout the room, offering encouragement, correcting form, and ensuring that everyone was working at their appropriate level. She had developed a teaching style that was firm but supportive, pushing people to challenge themselves while maintaining a positive, non-intimidating atmosphere. Thompson quickly became frustrated with the pace and structure of the class. He was used to intense, competitive workouts that focused purely on physical performance rather than the more holistic approach that Sarah employed. He began making disparaging comments under his breath, rolling his eyes at Sarah's encouragement of the other participants, and generally displaying the kind of disruptive behavior that would have been immediately addressed in a military training context. Sarah tried to ignore Thompson's negative attitude, focusing on the other participants who were enjoying the class and getting a good workout. However, his behavior was becoming increasingly disruptive, and she could see that it was affecting the mood and energy of the other participants. Some of the military personnel in the class seemed uncomfortable with Thompson's presence, possibly recognizing him as an officer and feeling unsure about how to respond to his obvious disapproval. About halfway through the class, Sarah introduced a partner exercise that required participants to work together in pairs. This type of exercise was designed to build teamwork and communication while providing an effective workout. Most of the class paired up quickly and enthusiastically, but Thompson remained standing alone, his arms crossed and his expression showing clear disdain for the activity. Sarah approached Thompson professionally, suggesting that he could either partner with someone or modify the exercise to work alone. She maintained her pleasant instructor demeanor despite his obvious hostility, trying to keep the class moving smoothly. Thompson's response was immediate and inappropriate. He began questioning Sarah's qualifications, criticizing her teaching methods, and making it clear that he considered himself above following instructions from a civilian. The tension in the room became palpable as other participants stopped their exercises to watch the confrontation. Military personnel in the class were caught in an impossible situation. They couldn't directly challenge an officer's behavior, but they were uncomfortable with the way he was treating their respected fitness instructor. The civilian participants were simply shocked by Thompson's unprofessional conduct. Sarah tried to de-escalate the situation by suggesting that Thompson might prefer a different type of workout, offering to help him find an alternative that would better suit his preferences. Her response was calm and professional, exactly the kind of conflict resolution that her training and experience had taught her. She was trying to maintain the positive atmosphere of her class while addressing Thompson's concerns in a respectful manner. However, Thompson interpreted Sarah's diplomatic response as a challenge to his authority. In his mind, a civilian contractor had no right to suggest anything to a military officer, regardless of the context or her professional expertise. His anger began to build, fed by his long-standing issues with authority, his sense of entitlement, and his inability to handle situations where he wasn't automatically deferred to by others. The confrontation escalated quickly as Thompson's voice rose and his language became more aggressive. He began questioning not just Sarah's methods, but her right to be working with military personnel at all. His comments became personal and inappropriate, crossing the line from professional criticism to personal attack. The other participants in the class watched in growing discomfort as the situation spiraled out of control. Sarah maintained her composure remarkably well, continuing to speak calmly and professionally despite Thompson's increasingly aggressive behavior. She tried once more to redirect the conversation, suggesting that they could discuss any concerns he had about the fitness program after the class was completed. This reasonable suggestion only seemed to inflame Thompson's anger further, as he interpreted it as another attempt to dismiss his authority. The breaking point came without warning. Sarah had just finished explaining a modified version of the partner exercise to accommodate different fitness levels when Captain Thompson completely lost control. His face flushed red with anger, his fists clenched at his sides, and without any further verbal warning, he struck Sarah across the face with a sharp, vicious slap that echoed throughout the gym. The sound of the blow was like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. Sarah stumbled backward, her hand instinctively going to her cheek where a bright red mark was already forming. The force of the strike had been significant enough to knock her slightly off balance, and the shock of the unprovoked attack left her momentarily stunned. The 20 other people in the class stood frozen in disbelief, unable to process what they had just witnessed. For a few seconds, the gym was completely silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the mechanical hum of the air conditioning system. Then the reality of what had happened began to sink in for everyone present. A military officer had just physically assaulted a civilian contractor in front of multiple witnesses, crossing a line that would have serious consequences under both military law and civilian criminal law. Private First Class Jennifer Walsh, a 22-year-old soldier who had been attending Sarah's classes for several months, was the first to react. Despite the military hierarchy that normally prevented lower-ranking personnel from confronting officers, she immediately stepped forward and positioned herself between Sarah and Captain Thompson. Her training kicked in and she began assessing the situation for additional threats while simultaneously reaching for her cell phone to call for help. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Jennifer asked Sarah while keeping her eyes on Thompson, who was still standing with his fists clenched and his face contorted with rage. Jennifer's military training had taught her to prioritize the safety of non-combatants, and she was prepared to physically intervene if Thompson made any move towards Sarah again. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a 30-year-old career soldier who had been working out near the back of the class, was already moving toward the gym's emergency phone. Rodriguez had served 2 tours overseas and had seen enough violence to recognize when a situation was about to escalate further. He knew that Thompson's behavior had crossed every possible line and that immediate intervention by higher authorities would be necessary to prevent further harm. Thompson seemed momentarily shocked by his own actions, as if he was just realizing what he had done. However, instead of showing remorse or attempting to apologize, his anger seemed to intensify. He began shouting at the other class participants, ordering them to mind their own business and threatening disciplinary action against any military personnel who interfered. His threats were both inappropriate and legally meaningless, as his authority as an officer did not extend to covering up criminal behavior. "All of you get back to your exercises," Thompson shouted, his voice echoing off the gym walls. "This is none of your concern. I am ordering you to disperse immediately." His attempts to use his military rank to control the situation only served to demonstrate how completely he had lost touch with reality and appropriate behavior. Sarah, still holding her injured face, began to regain her composure. Despite the shock and pain of the assault, her professional training and natural resilience helped her focus on the immediate situation. She realized that she needed to document what had happened and ensure that proper authorities were notified. She also recognized that several military personnel in the room were in an extremely difficult position, caught between their duty to follow orders and their moral obligation to prevent further harm. "Everyone needs to stay calm," Sarah said, her voice shaky but determined. "Jennifer, please call the military police. Michael, can you contact the base commander's office? I need to make sure this incident is properly reported." Her ability to maintain some level of control and rational thinking in the aftermath of the assault impressed the military personnel present and would later be noted in the official reports. Thompson's response to Sarah's reasonable requests was to become even more agitated. He seemed to believe that he could still control the situation through intimidation and the assertion of his authority. "You have no right to give orders on this base," he screamed at Sarah. "I am a captain in the United States Army. You are nothing but a civilian contractor who doesn't understand military protocol." What Thompson failed to realize was that his actions had already been reported. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had reached the emergency phone and was speaking directly to the base's command center. Within the military system, certain types of incidents trigger immediate responses that cannot be stopped or controlled by individual officers, regardless of their rank. The assault of a civilian contractor by military personnel was exactly the type of serious incident that required immediate investigation by multiple authorities. The base command center received Rodriguez's report at exactly 10:47 a.m. The duty officer, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Barnes, immediately recognized the severity of the situation and began implementing emergency protocols. An incident involving physical assault by a military officer required notification of the base commander, the military police, the Judge Advocate General's office, and potentially civilian law enforcement, depending on the circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes had served in the military for 18 years and had never received a report quite like this one. Physical altercations between military personnel were serious, but not uncommon, and there were established procedures for handling such incidents. However, an unprovoked assault on a civilian contractor during a fitness class represented a completely different level of misconduct that could have far-reaching consequences for both the individual involved and the entire base. Within 3 minutes of receiving the initial report, Lieutenant Colonel Barnes had contacted Colonel Harrison's office and dispatched military police to the gym. She also initiated contact with the base's legal office and began preparing the documentation that would be required for what was obviously going to be a complex and serious investigation. The efficiency of the military's response system meant that help was already on the way before Thompson had even finished his tirade against the witnesses. Meanwhile, in the gym, the situation continued to deteriorate. Thompson seemed incapable of recognizing that his career was effectively over and that continuing to make threats would only make his situation worse. Instead of attempting to control his behavior or show any remorse for his actions, he began making increasingly wild accusations against Sarah, claiming that she had deliberately provoked him and that she was unsuited to work with military personnel. Several of the civilian participants in the class, including two military spouses who had been attending Sarah's classes for months, began gathering their belongings and moving toward the exit. They were clearly uncomfortable with the ongoing confrontation and concerned about their own safety. However, the military personnel in the class remained, understanding that they would likely be needed as witnesses and that leaving the scene could complicate the investigation. Private First Class Walsh continued to position herself between Sarah and Thompson, despite his increasingly angry demands that she step aside. Her actions were both professionally appropriate and personally courageous, as she was risking potential retaliation from a superior officer. However, Walsh understood that her duty to protect civilian personnel superseded any obligation to defer to Thompson's inappropriate demands. "Sir, I respectfully suggest that you step back and allow the situation to be handled by appropriate authorities," Walsh said, using the formal language that military protocol required when addressing a superior officer, even in these extraordinary circumstances. Her words were carefully chosen to be respectful, while still making it clear that she would not allow further harm to come to Sarah. Thompson's response was to threaten Walsh with court-martial proceedings, demonstrating his complete ignorance of military law and appropriate conduct. An officer who had just committed assault had no authority to threaten disciplinary action against personnel who were following proper procedures to protect civilian safety. His threats were not only inappropriate, but potentially criminal, as they could be interpreted as attempts to intimidate witnesses. The first military police officers arrived at the gym at 10:52 a.m., just 5 minutes after the initial report had been made. Sergeant First Class David Kim and Corporal Lisa Zhang entered the gym with their hands positioned near their weapons, not knowing exactly what kind of situation they would encounter. Their training had prepared them for various types of disturbances, but reports involving officer misconduct required especially careful handling due to the political and legal complexities involved. When the MPs entered the gym, they immediately took control of the situation. Sergeant Kim approached Thompson while Corporal Zhang went to Sarah to assess her condition and gather initial information about what had occurred. The presence of trained law enforcement personnel changed the dynamic in the room instantly, as even Thompson seemed to realize that the situation had moved beyond his ability to control or influence. "Captain Thompson, I need you to step away from the other personnel and come with me," Sergeant Kim said, using the tone of voice that MPs are trained to employ in situations involving superior officers. The instruction was phrased as a request rather than an order, but the intent was clear. Thompson's freedom to move about the scene was now restricted pending investigation of the incident. Thompson initially attempted to assert his authority over the military police, apparently believing that his rank gave him some kind of immunity from investigation. "Sergeant, I am ordering you to arrest that woman for insubordination and disrupting military operations," he said, pointing at Sarah. His demand was not only legally groundless, but demonstrated his continued inability to understand the gravity of his situation. Sergeant Kim's response was professional and firm. "Sir, we are here to investigate a reported assault. I need to separate the parties involved and gather information from witnesses. Please cooperate with our investigation." Kim's experience had taught him how to handle situations involving officer misconduct without unnecessarily escalating tensions while still maintaining appropriate control. While Sergeant Kim dealt with Thompson, Corporal Zhang was speaking with Sarah and documenting her injuries. The red mark on Sarah's face was clearly visible, and Zhang photographed it from multiple angles using the specialized camera equipment that MPs carry for evidence gathering. Zhang also began taking preliminary statements from witnesses, starting with Private Walsh and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. The formal investigation process was already beginning, and everyone present understood that this incident would have far-reaching consequences. Military justice operates on principles of accountability and discipline that apply to all personnel regardless of rank, and assault of a civilian contractor was the type of serious offense that could result in court-martial proceedings and criminal prosecution. Within 10 minutes of the MP's arrival, word of the incident had reached the highest levels of the base's command structure. Colonel Harrison had been in a budget meeting when his aide informed him of the situation, and he immediately canceled his remaining appointments and began making his way to the gym. The colonel understood that incidents involving civilian contractors required immediate attention from senior leadership, both to ensure proper handling and to minimize potential damage to the base's relationship with the civilian community. As news of the incident spread through the base's communication networks, 3 other senior officers also began converging on the gym. Colonel Sarah Williams, the base's staff judge advocate, had been notified because any incident involving potential criminal charges required immediate legal oversight. Colonel Robert Chen, the deputy base commander, came because protocol required senior leadership presence at any incident involving assault charges. Colonel Maria Santos, who oversaw base operations and civilian contractor relationships, responded because the incident directly impacted her area of responsibility. The convergence of 4 colonels on the gym within such a short time frame sent a clear message throughout the base that this incident was being treated with the utmost seriousness. In the military hierarchy, the simultaneous presence of multiple senior officers at an incident scene indicates that careers are at stake and that the full weight of military justice will be brought to bear. Colonel James Harrison arrived at the gym first, his face grim with the knowledge that this incident would have serious consequences for everyone involved. At 55 years old and with over 30 years of military experience, he had dealt with various types of misconduct cases. But assault of a civilian contractor by one of his officers was among the most serious situations he had ever encountered. As he entered the gym, he immediately assessed the scene and began taking control of what was clearly a volatile situation. "What is the current status?" Colonel Harrison asked Sergeant Kim, who quickly briefed him on what had occurred and the initial steps that had been taken. The colonel listened carefully, asking specific questions about the sequence of events and the condition of all parties involved. His experience had taught him that the first few hours of an incident investigation were crucial for establishing facts and ensuring that proper procedures were followed. While Colonel Harrison was receiving his briefing, Thompson seemed to finally realize the gravity of his situation. The presence of the base commander and the formal investigation process had apparently penetrated his earlier delusions about controlling the situation. However, instead of showing remorse or accepting responsibility for his actions, he began attempting to justify his behavior and minimize the significance of what had occurred. "Colonel, this entire situation has been blown completely out of proportion," Thompson said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that was very different from his earlier aggressive behavior. "The contractor was being insubordinate and refusing to follow reasonable requests. I simply used appropriate corrective action to maintain discipline during a training exercise." Colonel Harrison's response was immediate and uncompromising. "Captain Thompson, you are to remain silent unless directly questioned by investigating personnel. Any statements you wish to make should be made in the presence of legal counsel." The colonel's tone made it clear that Thompson's attempts to justify his actions were not only inappropriate, but potentially harmful to his own legal position. Colonel Sarah Williams, the staff judge advocate, arrived just as Colonel Harrison was instructing Thompson about his legal rights. Colonel Williams was 48 years old and had spent the last 12 years specializing in military law, including court-martial proceedings and the interface between military and civilian legal systems. She immediately understood that this case would require coordination between military justice authorities and civilian law enforcement, as assault charges could be prosecuted in either system. "Colonel Harrison, I need to speak with you privately about the legal implications of this incident," Colonel Williams said. We have potential violations of both the Uniform Code of Military Justice and civilian criminal law. The victim is a civilian contractor, which complicates jurisdiction and requires specific procedures for evidence preservation and witness protection. While the two senior officers conferred, Colonel Robert Chen, the deputy base commander, arrived and immediately began coordinating with the military police to secure the scene and ensure that all witnesses were properly interviewed. Colonel Chen understood that the investigation needed to be thorough and unimpeachable, as any procedural errors could compromise the eventual prosecution of the case. The fourth colonel to arrive was Maria Santos, who oversaw civilian contractor relationships and base operations. Colonel Santos was particularly concerned about the impact this incident would have on the base's relationship with civilian contractors and the broader community. She knew that news of an assault on a civilian employee would spread quickly and could damage the base's reputation and its ability to attract qualified civilian personnel. Colonel Santos approached Sarah, who was still being interviewed by Corporal Zhang. "Miss Mitchell, I want to personally apologize for what has happened to you today. This behavior is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values or standards of this installation. We will ensure that you receive all necessary medical attention and support during the investigation and any subsequent legal proceedings." Sarah appreciated the colonel's concern, but she was still processing the shock of what had occurred. "Thank you, Colonel. I just want to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen to anyone else. I've enjoyed working here and with the military personnel, but this incident has been very traumatic." Her response demonstrated both her professionalism and her genuine concern for the welfare of others who might work on the base in the future. The presence of 4 colonels at the gym had attracted attention throughout the base, and word of the incident was spreading rapidly through both official and unofficial channels. In the military environment, news travels quickly, and an incident involving senior officer response was the type of event that everyone would hear about within hours. The rapid response by senior leadership sent a clear message that misconduct would not be tolerated, regardless of the rank of the person involved. Thompson, meanwhile, was beginning to understand that his military career was effectively over. The presence of multiple colonels, the formal investigation process, and the serious demeanor of all the officials involved made it clear that this was not a minor disciplinary matter that could be resolved with a simple reprimand or counseling session. His earlier confidence and aggressive behavior had given way to a desperate attempt to minimize the consequences of his actions. "I request permission to speak with a military attorney," Thompson said, finally recognizing that he needed legal representation. His request was immediately granted, as military law requires that personnel facing serious charges have access to legal counsel. However, his earlier statements and behavior had already been documented and would become part of the formal record of the incident. Colonel Williams began coordinating with the base legal office to ensure that Thompson was provided with appropriate counsel while also initiating the formal court-martial process. The assault of a civilian contractor was a serious offense that would almost certainly result in formal charges and potential criminal prosecution. The colonel also began coordinating with local civilian authorities, as they might choose to pursue criminal charges independently of the military justice process. The investigation process continued throughout the afternoon, with military police interviewing each witness individually and documenting their statements. The witnesses' accounts were remarkably consistent, all describing an unprovoked assault that occurred without any physical threat or justification from Sarah. The clear and unambiguous nature of the incident made the investigation relatively straightforward from an evidence standpoint. Private First Class Walsh's statement was particularly powerful, as she had been closest to the incident and had immediately intervened to protect Sarah from further harm. Her actions demonstrated the kind of courage and integrity that the military values, and her willingness to confront a superior officer to protect a civilian would later be formally recognized by the base command. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's quick thinking in calling for help had ensured that the incident was properly reported and that appropriate authorities responded immediately. His military experience had taught him to recognize when situations required immediate intervention by higher authorities, and his actions helped prevent the incident from escalating further. The gym class participants, who were civilian contractors and military family members, provided statements that corroborated the military witnesses' accounts. Their perspectives were particularly valuable because they could describe Thompson's behavior from the viewpoint of people who were not bound by military hierarchy and who had no reason to minimize or exaggerate what they had observed. By late afternoon, Colonel Harrison had received preliminary reports from all the investigating personnel and had briefed his superiors at the regional command level. The incident would require notification of various military and civilian authorities, including the Inspector General's office, the Criminal Investigation Division, and potentially the Federal Bureau of Investigation, depending on how civilian authorities chose to proceed. Thompson was formally relieved of his duties and restricted to base pending the outcome of the investigation and any subsequent legal proceedings. His access to military facilities was limited, and he was prohibited from having any contact with Sarah or any of the witnesses. These restrictions were standard procedure for personnel facing serious charges, but they effectively ended his ability to function as a military officer. The speed and decisiveness of the response sent shockwaves throughout the base. Within hours of the incident, everyone knew that Captain Thompson had been removed from his position and was facing serious charges. The message was clear: regardless of rank or position, anyone who engaged in criminal behavior would face the full consequences of their actions. Colonel Harrison called a meeting of all senior officers on the base to discuss the incident and its implications. The meeting was not about the specific details of the case, which were still under investigation, but about reinforcing the standards of conduct expected of all personnel and ensuring that similar incidents never occurred again. This incident represents a complete failure of leadership and personal discipline, Colonel Harrison told the assembled officers. Every one of you is responsible for ensuring that the personnel under your command understand and follow both military regulations and basic standards of human decency. We will not tolerate any behavior that threatens the safety or dignity of civilian contractors or any other personnel on this installation. The impact on Thompson's unit was immediate and significant. The soldiers who had served under him began coming forward with their own accounts of inappropriate behavior, verbal abuse, and leadership failures that had previously gone unreported. The investigation expanded to include a comprehensive review of Thompson's entire tenure at the base, revealing a pattern of misconduct that had been hidden by fear and the hierarchical nature of military structure. Sarah, despite the trauma of the assault, chose to continue working at the base after taking a few days off to recover from the incident. Her decision to stay sent a powerful message about her resilience and her belief that the actions of one individual did not represent the character of the entire military community. The base command ensured that she received additional security measures and support services during her recovery. The criminal investigation proceeded on multiple tracks. The military justice system began preparing for court-martial proceedings, while civilian authorities considered whether to pursue criminal charges in civilian court. The thorough documentation and clear witness statements made prosecution viable in either system, and the decision about which approach to take would depend on various legal and policy considerations. Thompson's military attorney advised him to seek a plea agreement rather than risk a trial, where the evidence against him was overwhelming and the potential penalties were severe. The assault charge alone could result in significant prison time and a dishonorable discharge, effectively ending any hope of future employment in fields that required security clearances or background checks. The incident became a case study in military justice education, demonstrating how quickly inappropriate behavior could escalate into criminal conduct and how the military system responded to protect both its personnel and civilian contractors. The presence of 4 colonels at the scene within minutes of the incident showed that senior leadership was committed to maintaining the highest standards of conduct. Within 6 months, Thompson was court-martialed, convicted of assault and conduct unbecoming an officer, and sentenced to 2 years in military prison followed by a dishonorable discharge. The swift and decisive action taken by the military justice system demonstrated that no one was above the law and that the safety and dignity of all personnel, military and civilian alike, would be protected. The base implemented new training programs focusing on anger management, appropriate leadership techniques, and the proper treatment of civilian contractors. Sarah was asked to participate in developing these programs, and her insights helped create more effective policies for preventing similar incidents in the future. The 4 colonels who had responded so quickly to the incident were later commended for their decisive action and professional handling of a difficult situation. Their rapid response and commitment to justice had prevented a bad situation from becoming worse and had demonstrated the military's commitment to accountability and protection of all personnel. Years later, Sarah continued to work in military fitness programs, though she eventually moved to a different base for personal reasons unrelated to the incident. Her experience at Riverside had shown her both the potential dangers and the fundamental integrity of the military system, and she remained committed to serving military personnel and their families throughout her career. The incident served as a lasting reminder that leadership in the military requires not just technical competence and tactical knowledge, but also personal integrity, emotional control, and respect for the dignity and safety of all personnel. The swift response by senior leadership and the thorough investigation that followed demonstrated that the military justice system, when properly implemented, could effectively address even serious misconduct and maintain the high standards that the military requires.